The Sword and the Stone, Chapter 2. A good while later, when they'd been whistling and luring and following the disturbed and sulky hawk from tree to tree, Kay lost his temper. "Let him go, then," he said. "He is no use anyway." "Oh, we could not leave him," cried the wart. "What would Hobbs say?" "It is my hawk, not Hobbs," exclaimed Kay furiously. "What does it matter what Hobbs says? He is a servant." "But Hob made Coley. It is all right for us to lose him, because we did not have to sit up with him 3 nights, and carry him all day and all that. But we can't lose Hobbs' hawk. It would be beastly." "Serve him right, then. He is a fool, and it is a rotten hawk. Who wants a rotten, stupid hawk? You had better stay yourself if you're so keen on it. I am going home." "I will stay," said the wart sadly, "if you will send Hob when you get there." Kay began walking off in the wrong direction, raging in his heart because he knew that he had flown the bird when he was not properly in Yarrock, and the wart had to shout after him the right way. Then the latter sat down under the tree and looked up at Coley like a cat watching a sparrow, with his heart beating fast. It was well enough for Kay, who was not really keen on hawking, except in so far as it was the proper occupation for a boy in his station of life. But the wart had some of the falconer's feelings, and knew that a lost hawk was the greatest possible calamity. He knew that Hob had worked on Coley for 14 hours a day to teach him his trade, and that his work had been like Jacob's struggle with the angel. When Coley was lost, a part of Hob would be lost too. The wart did not dare to face the look of reproach which would be in the falconer's eye, after all that he had tried to teach them. What was he to do? He had better sit still, leaving the lure on the ground so that Coley could settle down and come in his own time. But Coley had no intention of doing this. He had been given a generous gorge the night before, and he was not hungry. The hot day had put him in a bad temper. The waving and whistling of the boys below, and their pursuit of him from tree to tree, had disturbed his never powerful brains. Now he did not quite know what he wanted to do, but it was not what anybody else wanted. He thought perhaps it would be nice to kill something, from spite. A long time after that, the wart was on the verge of the true forest, and Coley was inside it. In a series of infuriating removes, they had come nearer and nearer, till they were further from the castle than the boy had ever been, and now they had reached it quite. Wart would not have been frightened of an English forest nowadays, but the great jungle of Old England was a different matter. It was not only that there were wild boars in it, whose sounders would at this season be furiously rooting about, nor that one of the surviving wolves might be slinking behind any tree, with pale eyes and slavering chops. The mad and wicked animals were not the only inhabitants of the crowded gloom. When men themselves became wicked, they took refuge there, outlaws cunning and bloody as the gore-crow, and as persecuted. The wart thought particularly of a man named Wat, whose name the cottagers used to frighten their children with. He had once lived in Sir Ector's village, and the wart could remember him. He squinted, had no nose, and was weak in his wits. The children threw stones at him. One day he turned on the children and caught one, and made a snarly noise and bit off his nose too. Then he ran into the forest. They threw stones at the child with no nose now, but Wat was supposed to be in the forest still, running on all fours and dressed in skins. There were magicians in the forest also in those legendary days, as well as strange animals not known to modern works of natural history. There were regular bands of Saxon outlaws, not like Wat, who lived together and wore green and shot wagons, though these were small ones, which lived under stones and could hiss like a kettle. Added to this, there was the fact that it was getting dark. The forest was trackless, and nobody in the village knew what was on the other side. The evening hush had fallen, and the high trees stood looking at the wart without a sound. He felt that it would be safer to go home, while he still knew where he was, but he had a stout heart and did not want to give in. He understood that once Coley had slept in freedom for a whole night, he would be wild again, and irreclaimable. Coley was a passenger. But if the poor wart could only mark him to roost, and if Hob would only arrive then with a dark lantern, they might still take him that night by climbing the tree, while he was sleepy and muddled with the light. The boy could see more or less where the hawk had perched, about 100 yards within the thick trees, because the home-going rooks of evening were mobbing that place. He made a mark on one of the trees outside the forest, hoping that it might help him to find his way back, and then began to fight his way into the undergrowth as best he might. He heard by the rooks that Coley had immediately moved further off. The night fell still as the small boy struggled with the brambles, but he went on doggedly, listening with all his ears, and Coley's evasions became sleepier and shorter, until at last, before the utter darkness fell, he could see the hunched shoulders in a tree above him against the sky. Wart sat down under the tree so as not to disturb the bird any further as it went to sleep, and Cully, standing on one leg, ignored his existence. "Perhaps," said the Wart to himself, "even if Hob does not come, and I do not see how he can very well follow me in this trackless woodland now, I shall be able to climb up by myself at about midnight and bring Cully down. He might stay there at about midnight because he ought to be asleep by then. I could speak to him softly by name so that he thought it was just the usual person coming to take him up while hooded. I shall have to climb very quietly. Then if I do get him, I shall have to find my way home, and the drawbridge will be up. But perhaps somebody will wait for me, for Kay will have told them I am out. I wonder which way it was. I wish Kay had not gone." He snuggled down between the roots of the tree, trying to find a comfortable place where the hard wood did not stick into his shoulder blades. "I think the way was behind that big spruce with the spike top. I ought to try to remember which side of me the sun is setting, so that when it rises I may keep it on the same side going home. Did something move under that spruce tree, I wonder? Oh, I wish I may not meet that old wild Wat and have my nose bitten off. How aggravating Cully looks, standing there on one leg as if there was nothing the matter." At this there was a quick whir and a smack, and the Wart found an arrow sticking in the tree between the fingers of his right hand. He snatched his hand away, thinking he had been stung by something, before he noticed it was an arrow. Then everything went slow. He had time to notice quite carefully what sort of an arrow it was, and how it had driven 3 inches into the solid wood. It was a black arrow with yellow bands round it like a wasp, and its cock feather was yellow. The 2 others were black. They were dyed goose feathers. The Wart found that, although he was frightened of the danger of the forest before it happened, once he was in it he was not frightened any more. He got up quickly, but it seemed to him slowly, and went behind the other side of the tree. As he did this, another arrow came whir and frump, but this one buried all except its feathers in the grass, and stayed still as if it had never moved. On the other side of the tree he found a waste of bracken 6 foot high. This was a splendid cover, but it betrayed his whereabouts by rustling. He heard another arrow hiss through the fronds, and what seemed to be a man's voice cursing, but it was not very near. Then he heard the man, or whatever it was, running about in the bracken. It was reluctant to fire any more arrows because they were valuable things, and would certainly get lost in the undergrowth. Wart went like a snake, like a coney, like a silent owl. He was small, and the creatures had no chance against him at this game. In 5 minutes he was safe. The assassin searched for his arrows and went away grumbling, but the Wart realized that, even if he was safe from the archer, he had lost his way and his hawk. He had not the faintest idea where he was. He lay down for half an hour, pressed under the fallen tree where he had hidden, to give time for the thing to go right away, and for his own heart to cease thundering. It had begun beating like this as soon as he knew that he had got away. "Oh," thought he, "now I am truly lost, and now there's almost no alternative except to have my nose bitten off, or to be pierced right through with one of those waspy arrows, or to be eaten by a hissing dragon, or a wolf, or a wild boar, or a magician, if magicians do eat boys, which I expect they do. Now I may well wish that I had been good, and not angered the governess when she got muddled with her astrolabe, and had loved my dear guardian Sir Ector as much as he deserved." At these melancholy thoughts, and especially at the recollection of kind Sir Ector with his pitchfork and his red nose, the poor Wart's eyes became full of tears, and he lay most desolate beneath the tree. The sun finished the last rays of its lingering goodbye, and the moon rose in awful majesty over the silver treetops before he dared to stand. Then he got up and dusted the twigs out of his jerkin, and wandered off forlorn, taking the easiest way and trusting himself to God. He had been walking like this for about half an hour, and sometimes feeling more cheerful, because it really was very cool and lovely in the summer forest by moonlight, when he came upon the most beautiful thing he had seen in his short life so far. There was a clearing in the forest, a wide sward of moonlit grass, and the white rays shone full upon the tree trunks on the opposite side. These trees were beeches, whose trunks are always more beautiful in a pearly light, and among the beeches there was the smallest movement and a silvery clink. Before the clink there were just the beeches, but immediately afterward there was a knight in full armor, standing still and silent and unearthly among the majestic trunks. He was mounted on an enormous white horse that stood as rapt as its master, and he carried in his right hand, with its butt resting on the stirrup, a high, smooth jousting lance, which stood up among the tree stumps, higher and higher, till it was outlined against the velvet sky. All was moonlit, all silver, too beautiful to describe. The Wart did not know what to do. He did not know whether it would be safe to go up to this knight, for there were so many terrible things in the forest that even the knight might be a ghost. Most ghostly he looked, too, as he hoved meditating on the confines of the gloom. Eventually the boy made up his mind that even if it were a ghost, it would be the ghost of a knight, and knights were bound by their vows to help people in distress. "Excuse me," he said when he was right under the mysterious figure, "but can you tell me the way back to Sir Ector's castle?" At this the ghost jumped so that it nearly fell off its horse, and gave out a muffled "bah" through its visor like a sheep. "Excuse me," began the Wart again, and stopped, terrified, in the middle of his speech. For the ghost lifted up its visor, revealing two enormous eyes frosted like ice, exclaimed in an anxious tone, What? Took off its eyes, which turned out to be horn-rimmed spectacles, fogged by being inside the helmet, tried to wipe them on the horse's mane, which only made them worse, lifted both hands above its head and tried to wipe them on its plume, dropped its lance, dropped the spectacles, got off the horse to search for them, the visor shedding in the process, lifted its visor, bent down for the spectacles, stood up again as the visor shut once more, and exclaimed in a plaintive voice, "Oh dear." The Wart found the spectacles, wiped them, and gave them to the ghost, who immediately put them on, the visor shut at once, and began scrambling back on its horse for dear life. When it was there, it held out its hand for the lance, which the Wart handed up, and, feeling all secure, opened the visor with its left hand, and held it open. It peered at the boy with one hand up, like a lost mariner searching for land, and exclaimed, "Aha! Whom have we here, what?" "Please," said the Wart, "I'm a boy whose guardian is Sir Ector." "Charming fella," said the knight. "Never met him in me life." "Can you tell me the way back to his castle?" "Faintest idea. Stranger in these parts myself." "I am lost," said the Wart. "Funny thing, that. Now I've been lost for 17 years. Name of King Pellinore," continued the knight. "May have heard of me, what?" The visor shut with a pop, like an echo to the what, but was opened again immediately. 17 years ago, come Michaelmas, and been after the questing beast ever since. Boring, very." "I should think it would be," said the Wart, who had never heard of King Pellinore, nor of the questing beast, but he felt that this was the safest thing to say in the circumstances. "It is the burden of the Pellinores," said the king proudly. "Only a Pellinore can catch it, that is, of course, or his next of kin. Train all the Pellinores with that idea in mind. Limited education, rather, fumets and all that." "I know what fumets are," said the boy with interest. "They are the droppings of the beast pursued. The harborer keeps them in his horn to show to his master, and can tell by them whether it is a warrantable beast or otherwise, and what state it is in." "Intelligent child," remarked the king. "Very. Now I carry fumets about with me practically all the time. Insanitary habit," he added, beginning to look dejected, "and quite pointless. Only one questing beast, you know, so there can't be any question whether she is warrantable or not." Here his visor began to droop so much that the Wart decided he had better forget his own troubles and try to cheer his companion, by asking questions on the one subject about which he seemed. Even talking to a lost royalty was better than being alone in the wood. "What does the questing beast look like?" "Ah, we call it the beast Gladysent, you know," replied the monarch, assuming a learned air, and beginning to speak quite volubly. "Now the beast Gladysent, or as we say in English, the questing beast, you may call it either," he added graciously. "This beast has the head of a serpent, and the body of a libbard, the hunches of a lion, and he is footed like a hart. Wherever this beast goes, he makes a noise in his belly as it had been the noise of 30 couple of hounds questing. Except when he's drinking, of course," added the king. "It must be a dreadful kind of monster," said the Wart, looking about him anxiously. "A dreadful monster," repeated the king. "It is the beast Gladysent." "And how do you follow it?" This seemed to be the wrong question, for Pellinore began to look even more depressed. "I have a brachet," he said sadly. "There she is, over there." The Wart looked in the direction which had been indicated with a despondent thumb, and saw a lot of rope wound round a tree. The other end of the rope was tied to King Pellinore's saddle. "I do not see her very well." Wound herself round the other side, I dare say. She always goes the opposite way from me. The wart went over to the tree and found a large white dog scratching herself for fleas. As soon as she saw the wart, she began wagging her whole body, grinning vacuously, and panting in her efforts to lick his face, in spite of the cord. She was too tangled up to move. "It's quite a good brachet," said King Pellinore. "Only it pants so, and gets wound round things, and goes the opposite way. What with that and the visor, I sometimes don't know which way to turn." "Why don't you let her loose?" asked the wart. "She would follow the beast just as well like that." "She goes right away then, you see, and I don't see her sometimes for a week. Gets a bit lonely without her," added the king. "Following the beast about and never knowing where one is. Makes a bit of company, you know." "She seems to have a friendly nature." "Too friendly. Sometimes I doubt whether she is really chasing the beast at all." "What does she do when she sees it?" "Nothing." "Oh, well," said the wart, "I dare say she will get to be interested in it after a time." "It is 8 months, anyway, since we saw the beast at all." The poor fellow's voice had grown sadder and sadder since the beginning of the conversation, and now he definitely began to snuffle. "It is the curse of the Pellinores," he exclaimed. "Always malocking about after that beastly beast. What on earth use is she, anyway? First, you have to stop to unwind the brachet. Then your visor falls down. Then you can't see through your spectacles. Nowhere to sleep, never know where you are. Rheumatism in the winter, sunstroke in the summer. All this horrid armor takes hours to put on. When it is on, it's either frying or freezing, and it gets rusty. You have to sit up all night, polishing the stuff. Oh, how I do wish I had a nice house of my own to live in, a house with beds in it, and real pillows and sheets. If I was rich, that's what I would buy. A nice bed with a nice pillow and a nice sheet that you could lie in. And then I would put this beastly horse in a meadow and tell that beastly brachet to run away and play, and throw all this beastly armor out of the window, and let the beastly beast go and chase himself. That I would." "If you could show me the way home," said the wart craftily, "I am sure Sir Ector would put you up in a bed for the night." "Do you really mean it?" cried the king. "In a bed?" "A feather bed." King Pellinore's eyes grew round as saucers. "A feather bed," he repeated slowly. "Would it have pillows?" "Down pillows." "Down pillows," whispered the king, holding his breath. And then, letting it out in one rush, "What a lovely house your gentleman must have!" "I do not think it is more than 2 hours away," said the wart, following up his advantage. "And did this gentleman really send you out to invite me in?" He had forgotten about the wart being lost. "How nice of him! How very nice of him, I do think. What?" "He will be pleased to see us," said the wart truthfully. "Oh, how nice of him!" exclaimed the king again, beginning to bustle about with his various trappings. "And what a lovely gentleman he must be to have a feather bed. I suppose I should have to share it with somebody," he added doubtfully. "You could have one of your own." "A feather bed of one's very own, with sheets and a pillow, perhaps even 2 pillows, or a pillow and a bolster, and no need to get up in time for breakfast. Does your guardian get up in time for breakfast?" "Never," said the wart. "Fleas in the bed?" "Not one." "Well," said King Pellinore, "it does sound too nice for words, I must say. A feather bed and none of those fumets for ever so long would take us to get there." 2 hours, said the wart, but he had to shout the second of these words, for the sounds were drowned in his mouth by a noise which had that moment arisen close beside them. "What was that?" exclaimed the wart. "Hark!" cried the king. "Mercy! It is the beast!" And immediately the loving huntsman had forgotten everything else, but was busied about his task. He wiped his spectacles upon the seat of his trousers, the only accessible piece of clothing about him, while the belling and bloody cry rose all around. He balanced them on the end of his long nose, just before the visor automatically clapped to. He clutched his jousting lance in his right hand, and galloped off in the direction of the noise. He was brought up short by the rope which was wound round the tree, the vacuous brachet, meanwhile, giving a melancholy yelp, and fell off his horse with a tremendous clang. In a second he was up again. The wart was convinced that the spectacles must be broken, and hopping round the white horse with one foot in the stirrup. The girth stood the test, and he was in the saddle somehow, with his jousting lance between his legs, and then he was galloping round and round the tree in the opposite direction to the one in which the Brachet had wound herself up. He went round 3 times too often, the Brachet meanwhile running and yelping the other way, and then after 4 or 5 back casts they were both free of the obstruction. "Yoicks, what?" cried King Pellinore, waving his lance in the air, and swaying excitedly in the saddle. Then he disappeared into the gloom of the forest, with the unfortunate hound trailing behind him at the other end of the cord.